Many, in fact, I would say most scientific studies have concluded that mainstream dams have more costs and benefits, particularly the transboundary cost. So the problem here in the region, and particularly on this issue of mainstream dams, is not the need for electricity. The strategic environmental study conducted for the MRC, and it was published in 2010, concluded that if all of the 11 dams were built that Mr. Cronin has described, they would contribute maybe 6 to 8% of total electricity consumption in the lower Mekong Basin. Well, that's not a very big number. In Thailand, for instance, the biggest market, and Vietnam, the second largest market in the LMB, both could achieve way more than 6% of demand by better plans for conservation and efficiency, better efficiency in their electrical system. So the real issue, it's important to underscore, is really not the basin needs electricity so much as Laos has a compelling national desire to exploit its significant hydropower potential to gain revenue from the project, to gain hard currency earnings, which the theory is that Laos then will apply those to its other development needs. So this is a kind of a conundrum that of the countries, each country has a different priority, and each country has different benefits and gains from development of the river system. And in Laos' case, small country, relatively low impact compared to the downstream countries, wants the revenue. And also Laos doesn't have enough money in its budget and in its national accounts to finance these projects. So the financing is done through concessions, giving concessions to foreign developers. The concessions are, in the case of most of the developers, the concessions are the desire to make profit from building these projects. And in the case of any projects that may be supported by China or carried out by Chinese companies, there's also always the element of kind of a strategic interest that China has in terms of promoting its integration with the region, promoting its influence, etc. So that's our version of the background to this issue, the stakes. The stakes are huge. The lower half of the Mekong River, south of China, including especially the Tonle Sap Lake of Cambodia, Great Lake of Cambodia, and the Mekong Delta, provide as much as 20% of the world's total fish production. So this is a very key factor in what people talk about as the nexus. That is the interaction of water, food security, energy, environment. The idea of the nexus is that you can't have everything, and so each thing you want has a cost, and the cost is reflected in other parts of your goals. And this area is also, unfortunately, still home to some of the poorest and most marginalized people in Southeast Asia, as well as, and certainly the Delta, Mekong Delta. So it's an issue of food security is a big issue, but also another big issue, which has already been mentioned, is the issue of sediment. So the Mekong Delta requires annually a new load of sediment from upstream countries and also from the Central Highlands to keep the delta protected against, build it up every year against the South China Sea. And of course, you know already that China's dams in Yunnan, Vietnam's dams, and other countries' dams in the Central Highlands, and on the so-called 3S river system, and land use decisions made in the delta itself have all contributed to a huge challenge right now for the delta to survive, particularly in the light of climate change and rising levels of the South China Sea. So currently there's a prevailing narrative about story, if you will, about the future of the Mekong, and mainly basically this narrative is that 11 dams were proposed, 9 dams in Laos. Laos is being the most active right now in promoting these dams. 2 dams, one dam, Sayabori Dam, is under construction, and the cover picture of our report was taken by Courtney when we made a site visit to both the Sayabori Dam and the Don Sahong project down on the Lao-Cambodian border. Anyway, the narrative is that MRC has failed. The so-called procedures for notification, prior consultation, and agreement of the MRC, which are based on a treaty, 1995 treaty, those procedures have failed to be even completely followed through. So then these first 2 dams are just the first 2, I would say, dominoes to fall, of 9 dams, for instance, that are proposed for Laos, the Lao and Lao Tai stretches of the river. Now, my Stimson colleagues, including not only Courtney, but also I didn't notice till recently, our newest colleague, Brian Eiler, is sitting down there towards the corner. We share many of the widespread criticisms of the MRC and its performance, but also of the governments and how they've handled these issues. And we're concerned about the projects going forward. But after much research, including site visits to the first 2 Lao projects I mentioned, and engagement with numerous experts, consultants, energy industry analysts, officials of the ADB, Asian Development Bank, bilateral donors, including the United States, who donate ODA to the region. After visiting the sites and talking to all these people, we believe that the existing, what we'd call worst case narrative, is that the river is doomed, may be overly pessimistic. One of the reasons, in a way, was indirectly established by Mr. Thuan in terms of looking at how intensely Vietnam and other countries have looked at this issue, what their agenda is, what their strategies are. And so it's not as if people are just walking away from the problem after these first 2 dams get started. So our research and our interactions with experts has raised credible doubts in our mind that rather than simply being the first 2 of up to 9 or 11 mainstream dominoes to fall, these commercial opportunity projects are likely to face significantly increasing political and financial risks and uncertainties. And we believe that even at this late stage, it's not too late for policy changes that could optimize the nexus trade-offs among energy, food, water, and other uses of water, on a lower Mekong basin scale. This is what you've been talking about, Mr. Tone, about how to do an integrated and cooperative, development process. So we think that these indicators that I'm just going to discuss now, briefly itemize, give hope for the fact that there will be some dams on the Mekong River, but not necessarily all those dams. And there still are opportunities in the future to do a better job of coordinating and assessing. Cautiously optimistic position is based on 5 key factors. First is that environmental and anti-dam activism by international and local civil society organizations has actually had more impact than these organizations and individuals actually believe. So our NGO friends who are strong advocates against the dams or for environmentalism or social issues, they think they're, no one listens to them, it's not going to, they're not making any headway. But in fact, people have listened, and they've not only laid out a good case for why these dams are bad for the river and the region, but they've also generated sustained awareness of the issues among all stakeholders. If no one spoke against these projects, 5-10 years ago, where would we be now? I think probably we'd be a lot further towards the destruction of the river by hydropower dams. So second is about the MRC's role. So the role of the MRC in its coordinating function, which can only be done with the agreement of the member countries, and its review process, particularly this PNPCA protocol for reviewing mainstream projects. These have been widely disparaged by critics, and in many cases with good reason. But in fact, the MRC still plays a very critical role, and in the case of the Sayaburi Dam in particular, the fact that Laos put the dam under the submitted the dam to the PNPCA process meant that, among other things, the MRC had regional meetings and discussions with stakeholders, etc. But perhaps more important, that PNPCA review required a technical review by MRC experts. And in the case of the Sayaburi Dam, the review was really damning, not to use a pun. It was very, very critical, and particularly on the issue of fish passes and the possible success of moving fish over this 30-some meter high dam, and also on sediment flows, because these dams track sediment, and every dam down the river that's added traps more sediment, and that doesn't go to the Mekong Delta where it's needed. So that review, in turn, third point, is that it provided not only critique but also some suggestions for possible improvements. And in the case of Sayaburi Dam, it delayed the project for more than a year already, and then caused the company to decide to spend from $200 to $400 million in money that was not budgeted for the project, to carry out additional research on fisheries and what's, understanding what the fish populations were in the area, what types, species, etc. And then to totally re-engineer the dam for a different kind of wider fish pass, add a fish lift, and then also to change out 4 of the gates for the dam, of 9 gates. 4 of the gates the MRC had suggested should be of a different design, so that they would more easily pass sediment during the dam's operations and in times when they might shut down and try to clear out the sediment that built up in the dam. So it caused this expense and delay. And then also in the case of the Don Sahong Dam, the developer, the Malaysian developer, was sort of saw what was happening and decided to commission more research themselves on fisheries in particular. Sediment isn't such a problem with Don Sahong Dam because it's only one channel through the area. But fisheries is the ability of fish to move through that Husahong channel, which was going to be blocked by the dam. The ability of them to move past that, inability of them to move past that once the dam was built, created a major concern about whether what would happen to the fish populations that migrate between the lower part of the Cone Falls through to the upper part of the river. So we visited that project and went around in small boats to visit channels where there's two channels. They're trying to deepen them and widen them to serve as alternative routes for fish migration. And they've sort of delayed still. They haven't started building the dam, although they've done site preparation, including a bridge that's been built by China's Sino-Hydro company, which is also the contractor to build the dam itself. But the main point is that these delays and added expenses have consequences if you're thinking about the business environment for these projects. So it's, what companies and countries can do, physically is one thing. What they can do in terms of economic return, finding financing for the projects, making them commercially viable, it's a different matter. And so we're trying to work on this part of the equation in particular. And so this process also, what is happening also raises serious doubts about whether the particular so-called private partnership model of infrastructure development is going to be viable into the future. These are projects where under the so-called build, own, operate, transfer method of building these projects is, what plays out over 35, 45 years. And so that's a big investment for a long return period. Increasingly companies are getting wary of this, and even, as Courtney may have a chance to say later on, even Chinese companies in China are getting wary of these long-term projects because the dams always cost more money than anticipated. They always underperform in terms of expected, generation of electricity. Then there's always delays, and so it's a big commitment to agree for a company or developer to agree to do the whole package of finding the financing, managing the project, supervising the construction by maybe a subcontractor, and then operating this thing for 35 or 40 years. In a political situation, they could be subject to considerable change, and also in terms of economic issues, energy prices worldwide are changing; they're falling, and there are other sources of energy that are coming on board. Cambodia, for instance, has gas reserves that it could exploit as an alternative to hydropower. And Vietnam, of course, is trying all of the various ways of alternative energy, including not only oil and gas in particular, but also renewables, like non-hydro renewables like solar and wind, etc. So then finally, in terms of this 5 points of why we think the new model is needed, a new narrative is needed. are the concerns of the donors about the impact of mainstream dams on food security and livelihoods and the future of the Mekong Delta. So these concerns on the part of donors, now they're not donors to the projects because no multinational bank yet, either the ABB or the World Bank, nor any of the donor countries would support, would finance the construction of any mainstream dam on the Mekong. They're just, it violates their own rules on environmental protection and on balance between development and environment. So they're not going to do that. But the main point is they still are donors to the countries. And in the case of the United States, we have this Lower Mekong Initiative, which involves the 4 Mekong countries plus Myanmar. And then the U.S. and other countries are bilateral donors to individual countries. And for a country like Laos, foreign aid of various kinds is still very important, even if it's not going to provide funding for their mainstream dam aspirations. It's still very important to Laos overall for its budget and its development. So the donors haven't led up, and the U.S. has kind of led, I would say, the development of a so-called Friends of the Lower Mekong initiative. And I happened to be in February this year at a meeting in Paksay, Laos, and down near in the south, near where the Don Song Dam was built. It was called an extraordinary meeting of the Friends of the Lower Mekong, or they called it XFLN, because it was at the vice ministerial level for the first time. And so I had an opportunity to be there unofficially as part of the U.S. delegation. And there was some, the donors have not let up on this issue. Out of politeness and diplomatic, niceties, they were restrained in telling Laos in particular what they thought it should do or not do. Almost every agency of the U.S. government department has some kind of role in the Lower Mekong in terms of, say, like capacity building efforts, technology transfer, policy reform, etc. So the countries haven't walked away from this issue, but they're also realistic. They, there's regional politics, there's international politics of the issue. There's the issue of where's the money going to come from to provide assistance, etc. But it's not going away. So I think I should probably wind up for now, except to just point out that two things I think first. First of all, there is this China factor. So on the Sayaburi Dam and the Don Song Dam, and then there's Latsua and another dam that are Lao Thai projects. You can see that the winds are blowing against this development model, this boot model, because of rising, political and financial risks. But in the next 2 projects that Laos wants to go ahead with would be Pak Bang and Pak Lay. You see them up on the board there, I think. And those projects are both Chinese projects. Now, the big question mark is, will China and Chinese developers look at these projects from a cost-benefit point of view, that is financial, cost-benefit, a profit point of view, or will China look at them as policy loans? For instance, will the Exim Bank of China or the China Development Bank provide loans even though the projects don't look so good in terms of the ability of the developer to pay back the loan eventually? And one answer to this is that things are changing even in China, and and China is also trying to reform its ODA process, or I shouldn't say ODA. China never gives ODA, which is concessional, but it's trying to reform its process for infrastructure development loans. And so that might have some effect. There could be some deterrent effect on going ahead with all these projects. Another view is, though, that in fact the Chinese are looking for the project not for the electricity so much, because in fact they don't need that electricity, but from a point of view of a package development that would include industrial parks and other investments like hotels, casinos, whatever, that would still make the project interesting to the government of China and the central government, and especially in terms of China's role and aspirations for role in Laos and Cambodia. So we don't know, how that's going to play out. But if we looked at this issue just from financial, economic rationale, these projects are not looking so good. So the question is whether other factors will come into play. And then finally, I just mentioned that we have a number of policy recommendations, and many of them have been mentioned, same idea from Mr. Tuan. But we do think that really important that there be credible EIAs and SIAs, environmental impact assessments, socioeconomic impact assessments, for any project way before it's begun. And that the data be freely published and be an opportunity for discussion, particularly among civil society, other stakeholders. And also, though, that Laos needs to work with other donors to get the capacity or the financing to carry out these studies. The MRC review process, we think, remains critical as regards, again, the technical review of the project. For reasons we can only on which we can only speculate, both the developers, both Don Sahong and Sayaburi developers, decided to do more research, decided to delay the project somewhat, and spend a lot of money. And so you have this question, well, why would they do that? Well, in some cases, maybe it's reputational risk for the company. But I think more than that, it's maybe unease about how these projects are going to work, and how successful they will be, and what will the impact be of the projects. And so that's why Sayaburi company spent all this money on re-engineering the dam for hopefully better fish passage and sediment transfer. And then I'll just mention lastly two points. One is we have been promoting the idea, Stimson has been calling for the idea of some kind of a Mekong standard for acceptable transboundary, maximum acceptable transboundary impacts. So that means you actually have to have either a Delta study or a Mekong Council study that's detailed enough to have the right data, or good national EIAs and SIAs to make that happen. But the main point is that the question, should one country, even though it's poor and wants the revenue and has the hydropower potential, be allowed to carry out a project which imposes huge costs on downstream countries, including especially Cambodia and Vietnam. And so we're trying to promote that concept. And then the other point is that Thailand, in particular, really needs to reassess its electricity needs and its need for the power from these projects. That's a deep bowl of competing, overlapping factors that to go into whether the Thai government wants to allow the Thai banks to go ahead and finance these projects. I'll stop there. I won't say more about that right now. We can talk about it later. But Thailand doesn't need this electricity. It is interested in diversifying its sources of energy, but it doesn't need the EGAT, the Electric Generating Authority of Thailand, can operate just fine without the power from these dams, particularly since it's already going to get Sayapori dam power. I'll stop for there. Thank you very much for your interest.